Welcome to the fourth episode of my Sergeant Pepper analysis video series. Today we'll be talking about what businesses can learn from Sergeant Pepper. Now, to me, Sergeant Pepper is like just a brilliant masterpiece that you can learn all kinds of things from, not just in a business sense, but the reason I'm focusing on business is because it was the Beatles' best-selling album. And of course, they're the best-selling group of all time. Sgt. Pepper's not the best-selling album of all time, but it's the Beatles' best-selling album. And if you want to know who had the best-selling album of all time in the world, that was Michael Jackson with Thriller. Could Michael Jackson been big without Paul McCartney's help on that album, who sang on one of the tracks? AC/DC has the second biggest album of all time, and this is by 2017 stats, but it could be even earlier. I'm just looking at Wikipedia. Thriller by Michael Jackson sold 65 million worldwide. Back in Black by AC/DC sold 50 million. Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, 45 million. All of those three are believable, but this is where the list gets a little sketchy. The Bodyguard soundtrack sold 44 million. I guess because of the song that Whitney Houston sings, I Will Always Love You, as if people had never heard that song before. It was written by Dolly Parton. Meatloaf, Bat Out of Hell. I'm not a fan, sorry, but that sold 43 million. Eagles, their greatest hits, Volume 1, 71 to 75, sold 42 million worldwide. Bee Gees and various artists, Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, 40 million worldwide. Fleetwood Mac, Rumors, 40 million worldwide. Shania Twain, Come On Over, 39 million. Led Zeppelin, 37 million. Michael Jackson, Bad, 34 million. I didn't know it did that well. It wasn't that good of a record compared to Thriller, at least. Alanis Morissette, Jagged Little Pill, 33 million. I didn't realize it had sold that many. And Celine Dion, I have to mention her. 32 million, I guess, tied with Beatles' Sgt. Pepper, 32 million. So there you have some of the stats on worldwide album sales of all time. It's always subject to change through time, so maybe 100 years from now the Beatles will have sold 65, 66 million and passed up Thriller with Sgt. Pepper. But I used to own the vinyl of each of these albums back in the 70s when I was in high school. But I gave it all away in the 90s. That's a good business trick. Give away all your stuff, because then people will love you. I gave that vinyl away because I moved from city to city, and it was hard to hang on to all that vinyl because it takes up so much space. Plus, it was scratched up by then, so it... vinyl does sound good when it's brand new and played on a really expensive turntable, but it doesn't sound good if those factors aren't in place. If it's all scratched up and it's old, it's going to skip and pop and it's going to sound like garbage. And on top of that, if you don't have a really good turntable, then it's just going to sound like trash. So I guess why businesses should pay attention to Sgt. Pepper as an important album in the history books of business, besides that it's the Beatles' best-selling album ever, is that it broke a lot of rules. And that's how you can be a winner sometimes in business, is break a bunch of rules. I don't mean break a bunch of laws like Wall Street did in the market crash of 2008. I mean like business rules, like rules, industry rules, like things that become standards that aren't necessarily laws. They're just things that the industry does. So some of the ways Sgt. Pepper broke rules is they didn't put out a single. Normally there's a single to promote the album, and that didn't happen. Radio stations latched on to a lot of songs on the album anyway, like certainly the title track and With a Little Help from My Friends. And then everybody knows all these songs. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, A Day in the Life. They're just well-known songs anyway. You know, another thing the business community can learn from Sgt. Pepper is that artistic, colorful designs matter. Okay, that's a very artistic album cover. Um, the Beatles started exploring that. You know, our album covers, like, I mean, all along it seemed like, but Rubber Soul has a cool look to it. A Revolver had a cool look to it. So, you know, just think of that. The stupid business mantra that art doesn't sell, that's outdated. Okay, you can't latch on to baloney like that. That's not true. Like every company on earth has a logo, which in some way relates to art. It took an artistic vision to design it, no matter how simple it is. So the Sgt. Pepper album cover, obviously the Beatles didn't design that themselves, but they had an artist that put a lot of work into it, obviously. And another thing we could learn from Sgt. Pepper is that it can involve a lot of imagination. That's the album itself is a concept about an imaginary band. Okay, and things don't always have to be happy and bright. You know, the business world, you walk into some freaking any store, name one, and there's this happy fake attitude from the freaking clerk. And it's not because they hire the happiest clerks on earth, it's because they're told to be that way. Okay, and they have to act that way to play a role, because there's this really ridiculous notion in the business world that upbeat, high energy is what sells everything. It's going to make people want to buy more. Okay, there might be some truth to that on a certain level with certain people, but someone like me, you're not going to sell me anything unless I really want it. And I think a lot of people are like that. The great thing about the Sgt. Pepper album is that every single song on it has an A+ quality to it. So remind yourself that when you're putting out a product, that it should be just completely awesome, that something people would want, that is just high quality. Another thing we can learn about Sgt. Pepper is that all the songs flow together. There's no gaps of silence in between the songs, except between side one and side two. That is something that is very subtle. What it means is they didn't waste any space on the album. They just basically used up as much space as they could with music, and they probably could have jammed some more songs on there, like Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane were meant for the album, but were left off so that those could be singles. But, you know, the album pretty much promoted itself, partly from the album cover. Also, the Beatles already had name value. They were already the biggest thing in music. And it also sold itself from the fact that it got a lot of press, and the rock critics loved it. So they talked about the songs, and they talked about how the orchestration was very different for Beatles compared to previous albums. Now, the Beatles didn't play on all the songs. Like She's Leaving Home, none of the Beatles were musicians on that recording. And they relied on classical musicians for that. And then the big thing, the orchestration in A Day in a Life, that wasn't the freaking Beatles, that was an orchestra. And another one, Within You, Without You, the Indian song, the Far East song with sitars, it didn't have any of the Beatles except George Harrison playing on it. So you can have a team, but it can also be a collection of solo projects. And that's kind of what Sgt. Pepper is, other than they did work together. Lennon and McCartney did work together a lot on songs like A Day in the Life. Two masterpieces merged together. Man, merging, that's a business term. So you can merge great ideas together, is what I'm trying to say. All right, and this album, if you notice, it has a lot of pop culture icons on the cover. That's another thing. You just tie into other popular themes. And why else was Sgt. Pepper an important album for the business community to educate themselves on? Go beyond the limits. That's probably the most important thing. It's a cohesive concept from start to finish, in the sense that it's about an imaginary band and an imaginary experience that takes you into a wonderful world of escapism. But at the same time, it's bigger than the sum of its parts. You've probably heard that before. It has synergy to it. Synergism, meaning the total project is bigger than the sum of its parts. So those are just some of the things you can learn from Sgt. Pepper. Other than that, I would say it is awesome songwriting. It took a lot of work. They spent more time on it than previous albums. And so they had that luxury because they had already become rich and could afford the studio time. Whereas a new band doesn't have that luxury because it costs a lot of money to rack up those hours. In 2017, it would cost probably 300 grand to make Sgt. Pepper, whereas back then it cost somewhere like around $30,000 to $60,000 in those 1967 dollars. So it turned around and sold a lot more. In other words, they made a ton of profit from that album. Part of the reason why Sgt. Pepper was so mind-blowing at the time is that there had never been an album like it before. There had never been a rock band that ventured into all that orchestration that was well known in the mainstream. There had never been something that psychedelic in the pop world before. It crossed boundaries. It crossed the orange pylon that I refer to sometimes. In other words, it ventured into uncharted territory. So don't be afraid to be experimental. Sometimes it's the key to success.